Imagine spending a night surrounded by hungry lions, where any movement could be your last. What would you do if your life depended solely on your faith? This is the story of Daniel, a man who, faced with almost certain death, chose to keep his faith unshaken, defying not only the wild nature of beasts, but also the power of an empire. In the intriguing and opulent courts of Babylon, where conspiracies and power walk hand in hand, Daniel stands out not for his wealth or influence, but for the firmness of his spirit and the purity of his conviction. His journey, marked by faith that defies logical explanation, leads us to question, how far are we willing to go to defend our deepest beliefs? Join us as we unravel how one man, with nothing but his prayers, faced the fury of lions and the envy of men, emerging not only alive, but eternally revered. This is not just a story of survival, it is a testimony to the transformative power of faith. Please subscribe to the channel and like this video so that this story can reach more people. Daniel was a young captive who had been taken to Babylon, far from his homeland. Despite being in a foreign place with different customs and beliefs, Daniel remained faithful to his convictions and his faith. He not only respected the traditions of his people, but also possessed a remarkable ability to interpret dreams, which earned him great respect and a prominent position in King Nebuchadnezzar's court. Over time, Daniel's wisdom and integrity caught the attention not only of the king, but also of other high-ranking officials in the palace. However, this admiration was not shared by everyone. Some courtiers, driven by envy, began to closely observe Daniel, hoping to find some flaw in his character that could be used against him. Yet Daniel was careful and faithful in all his duties, frustrating the plans of those who wished to see him fall. As Daniel continued to excel in his duties, the envy in some hearts of the palace grew. These courtiers, frustrated by their inability to find faults in Daniel's conduct, decided that the only way to bring him down would be to attack the most unshakable aspect of his life, his faith. They knew that Daniel had the habit of praying 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem, and saw this as the perfect opportunity to trap him. With cunning and malice, these men gathered to plot a sinister plan. Knowing the influence they had over the king, they proposed a new law that seemed to honor the monarch, but was in reality a trap for Daniel. They suggested that the king sign a decree forbidding anyone from making petitions to any gods or men, except to the king himself, for 30 days. The penalty for disobedience would be nothing less than being thrown into the lion's den. The king, flattered by the homage and unaware of the true intentions behind the proposal, agreed and signed the decree. With the plan in motion, the courtiers watched closely, waiting for the moment when Daniel would disobey the royal order to continue his devout practice of prayer, thus giving them the reason they needed to accuse him before the king. The royal decree was now in effect, and the king, though pleased with the new law that seemed to reinforce his authority, did not perceive the trap woven in the shadows of the palace. Meanwhile, Daniel, aware of the new order, faced a profound dilemma. The law of men now forbade what the divine law commanded him to do: pray to his God. For Daniel, however, abandoning his faith was not an option. As usual, as evening fell, Daniel opened the windows of his house that faced Jerusalem. He knelt and prayed, giving thanks and seeking God's guidance, as he had done all his life. Daniel knew the risks, knew the consequences, but his faith and commitment to God were greater than any fear he might feel. He did not pray out of defiance or spite, but out of a deep need to remain faithful to what he believed to be right and true. Outside, hidden in the shadows, the conspirators watched. They saw Daniel praying, openly defying the king's decree. With satisfied smiles and hearts full of malice, they prepared to bring their accusation to the king. They now had what they needed to accuse Daniel, an irrefutable proof of his disobedience. With this evidence, they headed to the palace, ready to confront the king with the truth about the man he so highly esteemed. In the palace, the tension was palpable. As the conspirators advanced through the sumptuously adorned corridors, armed with an accusation that could shake the very foundations of the kingdom. They brought with them news that, although anticipated, had the potential to deeply wound the king. Daniel, his trusted advisor, had disobeyed the newly decreed law. When they presented themselves before the king, the courtiers did not hide their zeal, detailing every moment of Daniel's disobedience. They described how he opened the windows of his house, knelt, and prayed to his God, openly defying the decree that prohibited such an act. Their words were precise, and their tone irrefutable. "Your Majesty," they said, "Daniel not only disobeyed your law, but he did so with an audacity that questions your very authority." The king, upon hearing these accusations, felt betrayed and at the same time trapped by his own words. He valued Daniel not only as an advisor, but also as a loyal and wise friend. Now, confronted with the obligation to enforce the law he had himself established, the king was torn between loyalty to an old friend and the demands of his position. He spent hours searching for a loophole, a way to save Daniel without discrediting his own authority. As the sun set and the shadows of the night began to lengthen, the king realized that his search for a solution was in vain. Reluctantly, he gave the order for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the lion's den, as stipulated by the decree. As Daniel was taken to fulfill his sentence, the king spent a night in vigil, tormented by the decision he had made and hoping, against all hope, for some sign of salvation. As night enveloped Babylon with its dark mantle, the king's heart was heavy. Daniel, his esteemed advisor, now faced a terrible fate, the lion's den. The orders had been given, and there was no turning back. Daniel was escorted by the guards to the entrance of the den, a deep hole in the ground where the roars of lions echoed off the stone walls. The courtiers who had plotted against Daniel watched from a distance, barely disguising the satisfaction on their faces as they saw the man of faith being led to what they believed would be his end. They thought this would be the final chapter of Daniel's story, a conclusion that would solidify their own power and influence in the kingdom. However, Daniel entered the den with a calmness that puzzled all who saw him. There was no fear in his eyes, only a serenity that came from an unshakable faith. As the lions roared, Daniel remained still, his silent prayers ascending like incense in search of divine protection. In the palace, the king spent a sleepless night, his mind tormented by the image of his friend in the den. Despair led him to question the laws he had imposed, and the dawn never seemed so distant. Yearning for a miracle, he awaited the first light of day to run to the den and discover Daniel's fate. Dawn brought with it a shroud of mist and a stillness that weighed heavily on the city of Babylon. With the first breath of morning, the king, exhausted after a night of worries and regrets, rose from his bed, unable to wait another moment. Still in his nightclothes, he ran to the lion's den, his heart pounding in time with his most desperate hopes. Upon arriving, the guard watching the sight opened the seal that kept the den's entrance closed. The king, his voice choked with anxiety and fear, called out Daniel's name, his voice echoing against the cold walls of the pit. "Daniel, servant of the living God," he cried, "has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" There was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Then, to everyone's amazement, a calm voice answered from the depths of the den. Daniel was alive. His voice was clear and serene, filled with a faith that knew no bounds. He recounted how an angel of the Lord had shut the mouths of the lions and that he was unharmed, protected by God's hand. The king breathed a sigh of relief, tears of joy mixing with the morning dew. He ordered that Daniel be immediately brought out of the den. As they did so, the first rays of the sun illuminated the face of the man who had triumphed over death with his faith. When Daniel was brought out of the den, the light of dawn revealed a man whose faith had withstood the most terrible test. There was no sign of injury on his body, nor fear in his gaze. Around him, the onlookers, including the king, could barely believe what they saw. It was a living testimony to the power of faith and divine intervention. The news of the miracle spread quickly through the palace and the streets of Babylon, causing many to question their own beliefs and the justice of the king's decrees. As Daniel was welcomed by a group of admirers and faithful followers, the courtiers who had plotted against him realized that their plan had failed spectacularly. They had tried to use the law to eliminate a righteous man, but instead, their actions resulted in an even greater demonstration of the protection and power of his God. The king, deeply moved by Daniel's faith and integrity, began to reflect on the consequences of his own decisions. He knew that something had to be done to correct the wrong and prevent future injustices. His respect for Daniel and the God he served only grew, and he felt compelled to take action. Determined to set things right, the king summoned his advisors and prepared to take measures that would resonate throughout the kingdom, restoring Daniel's honor and reaffirming a commitment to truth and justice. That morning, as the sun bathed Babylon in its golden light, the king, driven by a newfound understanding of divine justice, decided to rectify the injustices that had been committed against Daniel. He called an urgent meeting with his closest advisors, determined to undo the harm caused by the false accusers. The king clearly articulated his vision to the advisors. Not only had Daniel been wrongfully accused, but his integrity and faith had been supernaturally confirmed. It was necessary for the kingdom to acknowledge the gravity of the wrong done to such a faithful servant. Thus the king ordered that the courtiers who had conspired against Daniel be brought before him. When the conspirators were presented before the king, fear was evident on their faces. They had realized too late that their plan had not only failed, but had also turned against them. The king, with the authority of his position and the justice of his decision, pronounced the sentence: they would now face the fate they had intended for Daniel. As the conspirators were led to the lion's den, a new decree was being prepared. This decree would not only restore Daniel's honor, but also proclaim the protection of his God over those who serve truth and justice with a pure heart. The impact of this decree promised to spread throughout the kingdom, setting a precedent for faith and loyalty above human wickedness. With the palace still resonating from the acts of newly administered justice, the king ordered that a new decree be drafted, a document that would reflect the powerful lesson learned through Daniel's ordeal. This decree, unlike the previous one, would be a celebration of faith and divine protection, a testimony to the entire kingdom that true strength lies in integrity and commitment to the divine. The royal scribe, under the king's detailed instructions, carefully drafted each word, engraving in history the decision that exalted faith above human power. The decree declared that Daniel's God was the true protector, capable of saving his servants from any danger, even from the mouths of hungry lions. With the document completed, the king called an assembly of all the leaders and notable citizens of the kingdom. The square in front of the palace was packed with people, all eager to witness the change of course that His Majesty was about to announce. The air was thick with anticipation as the king prepared to proclaim the new decree. As the king read the words of the decree, the reaction among the crowd was mixed. Some were relieved by the justice done. Others were awed by the clear divine intervention in Daniel's life. This moment, rich in symbolism, not only restored Daniel's honor, but also redefined the relationship between faith and power at the heart of Babylon. As the king's words echoed through the square, the people of Babylon absorbed each phrase of the new decree, a proclamation that exalted Daniel's God as a supreme and protective being. The impact of this declaration was profound, altering not only the kingdom's politics, but also the hearts of many of its citizens. Daniel's faith, tested to the extreme, emerged not only intact, but now widely recognized and respected. Among the crowd, whispers of admiration and murmurs of reflection mixed with the fresh morning air. The stories of Daniel and his unwavering trust in his God spread like ripples, touching the hearts of many who had previously doubted the power of faith in the face of the king's authority. Daniel's influence grew, not through force or fear, but by the example of his integrity and divine dedication. As the king observed the crowd, his heart swelled with a new emotion. He realized that true leadership came with the responsibility to recognize and uphold justice, no matter how powerful a ruler might be. Inspired by Daniel's faith, he began to contemplate other reforms that could bring more justice and equality to his kingdom. These reflections soon began to take shape in actions, promising an era of renewal and hope for Babylon, guided by the principles that Daniel had upheld and demonstrated with his own life. As Daniel continued to serve in the palace, his story became a living legend, a tangible example of divine intervention and human resilience in the face of extreme adversity. Daniel's fame and the respect for his faith extended beyond the walls of Babylon, spreading among nations and peoples, crossing borders and generations. With the new decree in place, Daniel was exalted to an even higher position in the government. However, his demeanor remained unchanged. He continued to serve with humility and dedication, guided by the principles that had sustained him in the lion's den. Daniel's integrity, now more than ever, inspired both commoners and nobles alike, fostering an environment of mutual respect and sincere worship. Meanwhile, the king observed the changes his decision had set in motion, reflecting on the power of faith and belief. The transformation of Babylon, from a court marked by conspiracies and fears to a kingdom of faith and justice, was a testament to the impact that a single devoted man, supported by wise leadership, could have. In this climate of renewal, the king began to consider other areas of government and society that needed reform. Inspired by Daniel's wisdom and faith, he planned to extend these principles beyond matters of worship and loyalty, seeking to create a more just and equitable society for all his subjects. As Daniel continued to hold a prominent position in the kingdom's administration, his example served as a beacon for all those who sought guidance and inspiration. He was not just a symbol of faith, but also an active architect of the reforms the king was implementing. Together, they worked to ensure that the injustices of the past would not be repeated, strengthening laws that protected the weak and encouraging the practice of compassion and justice. In this atmosphere of renewal, Daniel's figure resonated particularly with those who had previously felt marginalized or unprotected by the law. His legacy was a testimony that true faith and dedication to just principles could not only save a life, but transform an entire culture. Thus, as Babylon restructured itself under these new ideals, the king and his subjects contemplated Daniel's most enduring lesson, that true strength comes from a life lived with integrity and faith, and that every act of courage and every decision guided by truth can reverberate through time, inspiring changes that go beyond immediate circumstances to touch the future in unimaginable ways. Daniel's story in the lion's den ends not with the roar of the animals, but with the reverent silence of those who witnessed his faith come to life. The king's decree, inspired by respect and admiration for Daniel's integrity, became a manifesto of faith and justice that echoed throughout the kingdom. Daniel's decision to remain faithful to his beliefs, even in the face of death, and the subsequent change in the king's attitudes, illustrate the transformative power of true conviction. This story clearly shows that the courage to maintain integrity in the face of adversity not only protects the individual, but also inspires significant changes around them. Daniel, with his unbreakable faith, not only survived a night among lions, but also sparked a revision of the practices and laws of an entire empire. As we reflect on Daniel's journey, we see a mirror of our own lives. The decisions we make and the integrity we maintain influence not only our destiny, but also the world around us. Daniel's story teaches us that even in the darkest circumstances, standing firm in our most sacred principles can light the way not just for ourselves, but for all those who watch us. Thus, the true measure of our faith and character is often revealed in moments of greatest trial. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel in the lion's den and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, don't forget to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.